Hey everybody, it's Chase with AV Pop Culture again, and today we are here to take a look at the top 15 horror movies from my favorite decade ever, the 1980s. We have the 15 most 80s of 80s horror movies. So pop that tape in, I got you, let's go do this. All right, so 80s horror movies. So a little caveat here. This isn't just like the top 15 best 80s horror movies of all time. It is the best, most 80s horror movies of all time. So what I'm looking for here is not just our favorite or what I consider the best horror movies, but the most 80s, the ones that give off the most 80s vibes. So they got to be good and they got to be all in with 80s. The whole 80s of it all has to be in those movies. That is my top 15. I'm going to start with one other sort of public service announcement here. Every time I put Gremlins on a horror list, I catch grief from one side that says it's not horror. If I don't put it on a horror list, I catch grief from the other side that says, where is the Gremlins? This is horror. So this one is going to kind of be just a special one that I want to mention, because if you consider this horror, this is very high on the 80s vibe and 80s horror list. If you consider this more of a dark comedy, then you wouldn't have it on this list at all, I guess. But this thing drips with 80s. Now, I would personally consider this a horror movie. I think it's a horror film. But I am just going to leave that whole drama out, because you're going to see Gremlins on some upcoming lists of mine. And I wanted to talk about it here. So Gremlins is just this little honorable mention. Now that we've got that out of the way, let's get to the top 15 on this list. All right, coming in at number 15 is one that is a little lower, because you probably don't think of this one because it's more of a sci-fi horror, Lovecraft, but I am talking about From Beyond. Now, this is the Great Vinegar Syndrome 4K here. This movie is 100% 80s vibes. Now, it's Lovecraft, but like when you go in and you watch the movie and you even like write down the things like Ken Foree wearing like a jersey shirt, the way they dress, the whole like dialogue. You got Barbara Crampton with these big like shoulder pads in her suit jacket and her skirt suit jacket, the big oversized glasses, the hairdo. Everything about it's 100% 80s. And then you go in even further to when she kind of gets out of character and she puts on the kind of like sexy underwear outfit, like the corset and the panties kind of thing, and she's got the big teased up hair and all that kind of stuff. It is 100% 80s. The sexual innuendo and everything, all that kind of stuff that maybe people got too sensitive to later. It's 100% 80s, and it is a great movie. I actually think it was a fight between this and Reanimator for this spot, because I was only going to put one. I actually think I like this movie better, and I think it has, in some ways like that, like more of an 80s vibe to me. But you could argue Reanimator. I'm going with this one. From Beyond comes in at number 15 on the list. Now, at number 14 on the list is one that just barely makes it into the 80s because it's 1980, and I am talking about The Fog. John Carpenter is The Fog. Now, when I think of particularly like late 70s, but really early to mid 80s when I was growing up, if you follow me, I've talked about this before, the whole late night FM sexy voiced DJ that kind of narrates the horror movies, and that late night DJs, FM DJs, were huge in the 80s, big time. Like it carried over from the mid late 70s. And you have Adrienne Barbeau in here filling that role. And every time I pop this movie in, it just triggers 80s for me. And then you have the old school, like, practical effects. John Carpenter, the music, the look and feel of the film is, some people would say 70s because it's shot in the 70s. But you have to understand, especially where I grew up, like in rural Georgia, and things didn't move as fast back then. So really that late 70s / early 80s look carried on into, like, 84, 85, 86. The same way if you go back and look, like the 80s and late 80s really carried over into like 93, 94. Like a lot of the things kind of slowly carried over. Now we're fast to change stuff. What we really do is go back to old stuff. But this movie is just synonymous with 80s with me. And you have, Jamie Lee Curtis, Tom Atkins, Adrienne Barbeau, all these people who are doing so many horror movies around that time. And of course, John Carpenter, huge in the 80s. So The Fog comes in at number 14 on my list. At number 13 on my list is one that's definitely synonymous with the 80s in the look and the feel of it. But it's a little lower on the list because I don't feel like overall there's as much like to distinguish it as specifically 80s. There's some things, which is why it's on here, but it's a classic from the 80s. It definitely does have 80s vibes to it with the blue lightning and all that stuff, the animation, everything. I am talking about Creepshow. When you have the creep, out there, and even when he is like in a physical form outside and the blue lightning and all that kind of stuff, 100% 80s. Like just 100% 80s. And you've got Stephen King in here, oh golly gee, like hamming it up. And again, you got Adrienne Barbeau in here. This thing just screams 80s. Everybody remembers Creepshow. It's the classic anthology. And you could maybe argue that Creepshow 2 might even have more 80s vibes to it, but I don't like Creepshow 2 as good. So Creepshow comes in on our list, bringing the classic anthology. I mean, you got George Romero, you got, everything comes together. This has to be on your list. Comes in at number 13. At number 12 on our list is one nobody can argue about, Poltergeist. They're here. You've got Spielberg, you've got Tobe Hooper, you've got Craig T. Nelson in here, who did a lot of stuff in the 80s. And Joe Beth Williams with, again, with those jersey shirts, man. That stuff, like the jersey shirts and the longer socks and stuff, that stuff I really remember from the 80s. But like the whole TV that Carol Ann's looking at, it's very 80s. It's a very 80s suburban family, all that kind of stuff. It has all of those like 80s suburban vibes to it. It is an absolute classic. Spielberg's fingerprints all over it. Tobe Hooper's fingerprints all over it. Just screams 80s. Synonymous with the 80s is Poltergeist. So it comes in at 15, 14, 13, 12 on our list. The next one on our list is one I've talked about on this channel a lot. And I think with the soundtrack, the costumes, the way the characters dress, act, the whole vibe of this movie is very punk rock, very 80s. Return of the Living Dead. The Linnea Quigley scene, the way her character dresses, the way she strips, the way they're all watching her, they're dancing in the graveyard, the music, the Tar Man. I don't have my Tar Man hat on today. This is 100% 80s. The way it moves, the way it's shot, the music, the iconography of it. I mean, that alone is 100% 80s. If you were there, that's very punk rock, very 80s. I think of it as 80s. It's synonymous with the 80s for me. And you cannot go wrong with the Return of the Living Dead. Just a ton of fun. It comes in at number, 11 on our list. we are into the top 10 already. So top 10 is one that I just saw for the first time ever, and it jumped way up my list. I don't know how I missed this movie growing up. I was a prime age for this movie. I have a brother who is 4 years older than me. He might as well, other than the fact that he played football too, he might as well have been the kid in this movie. I am talking about Trick or Treat. Wow, the 80s just stream off of this movie. Like, honestly, you could argue this should be higher on the list if you've seen it. Because as I described it in my review, this is like a horror version of Weird Science. And nothing screams 80s to me more than Weird Science. And then you have the horror tropes. You've got the blue lightning in there. You've got Gene Simmons in here. You've got Ozzy Osbourne doing a cameo. You have all of the rock music. The kid that's into the 80s hair band rock and roll singer with his posters on the wall. Very early MTV style. The way he dresses, the music in here. You got Gene Simmons again as a DJ coming in. They're listening to records. He's spinning a record backwards. All that stuff was very 80s. Very like the whole satanic panic of the 80s. I remember that. I remember my brother and I playing records backwards, Kiss records, all that kind of stuff to see if there was anything on there. Ozzy Osbourne records, which I have somewhere. I showed some of my record collection in my room tour, but like my Kiss albums and everything are around here somewhere too. And I don't know, this thing just, the scene where Sammy Kerr comes back from the dead is a very Weird Science. Blue lightning, colors. You've got the old school stereo system and speakers. You got the old school Pepsi can spilling. Just 80s Easter eggs everywhere. They weren't Easter eggs, they were time period, but now you watch them and it's just like, it's 80s, it's 80s, it's 80s. This thing screams it. It cracks the top 10. Trick or Treat. Great release right here. Great release right here. All right. 15, 14, 13, 12, 11, 10. We're at 9. Now, 9, you might expect this one to be higher. This is one of my favorite horror movies of all time. It's the first horror movie that I ever saw. And synonymous with that early, like 1984, just a massive year. I am talking about Nightmare on Elm Street. Super cool blockbuster box set here. This movie, and of course I got the Steelbook. The new 4K, I got the other big collector set because this is the first horror movie I remember seeing. I was like, it came out in 84 and it hit the movie rental places like maybe late 85, early 86, and I rented it. My brother and I did and watched it at home. That's the first time I saw it. And it holds a special place in my heart. Of course, very 80s, the way they are dressed, the makeup. I mean, you go to the Johnny Depp scene, the scene where Johnny Depp gets killed in the movie. The way he's dressed, again with the jersey shirt. This one's cut off. He's got the short shorts. He's got on like the long socks. He's got the big earphones on. He's got the little plastic, white plastic portable TV that's a black and white, click, click, click dial TV. Exact one I had. Like, that is the exact TV that I had in my room when I finally got a TV. I watched everything in black and white until I was probably 12, 11 on that little TV. And then I got this little 19-inch wood grain color TV. But just that scene alone just drips 80s. Freddy Krueger became synonymous with the 80s. He built this huge following. Wes Craven, all this stuff, very, very 80s. You could argue that maybe Dream Warriors feels more 80s overall. But if I'm only going to pick one to represent, you got to pick the original. That was a massive year in movie history. Make sure you check out my best years in movie histories videos. Got a couple more of those coming before we decide which was the best year overall. But screams 80s, synonymous with the 80s is Nightmare on Elm Street. And it comes in here at number 9 on our list. At number 8 on our list, you're going Nightmare on Elm Street. Well, now you're going Friday the 13th, the final chapter. This one, so look, the minute you put Corey Feldman in it, it jumps up the 80s nostalgia a notch. And then the fact that Corey Feldman in this movie is like obsessed with, horror movies himself. Like he's a horror and movie kid, a horror movie makeup kid. He's into all that. A lot of us that grew up around that time that were into movies and horror movies and stuff, the only way you could connect with anything was there was like mail order stuff. Like you could mail order for a makeup kit. You could mail order for a mask. You could mail order for like a magazine, all that kind of stuff. And when I say mail order, I'm talking about you sent like a check with a paper clipping. You mailed it to the address. You waited on it to come back. This was like a 6-week process most of the time, at least. And the whole, like, Corey Feldman being in here, of course, Friday the 13th started in the 80s. It's very synonymous as a franchise with the 80s. But when you have Corey Feldman in here and everything that he's into just plays into that, to me, this one throws off some of the most 80s vibes of any of the movie in the franchise. It's one of my favorite movies in the franchise. So Friday the 13th, the final chapter, comes in at number 8 on our list. At number 7 on our list is, I'm going back to John Carpenter one more time, and this one leans more into sci-fi, horror, action. This is a conglomeration with a lot of commentary that's super pertinent today and was kind of pertinent on like in a different way back then. I am talking about They Live. This whole thing with the rise of 80s consumerism and John Carpenter's take on that, is all throughout this movie. It's the whole, like the premise of this movie. They live, you sleep. Everything is about consume, obey, the rise in consumerism, how consumerism can control you and appease the masses while other things are going on behind the scenes. At the time, it was kind of geared towards the rise of the yuppie culture in the 80s. And now I feel like it's flipped and it's like it's on the other side and pertinent again. And then the fact that you throw in Rowdy Roddy Piper in here, who was a huge wrestling star in the 80s, an 80s icon from a wrestling standpoint. Everything that's old is new again. And this movie has come back around to really have to be very pertinent today. And the social commentary, though, at the time is very 80s. The look is very 80s. Rowdy Roddy Piper, all of it encapsulates the 80s. So They Live has to be on your 80s, most 80s feeling horror movie list. It comes in here on ours. Now, the next one, we are at we got 6 left. There's zero argument. You might not like this movie. You might find this movie I'm about to talk about very cheesy, what have you. There is no arguing that it is full of 80s. And I am talking about Chopping Mall. Listen, y'all, this 80s and into the 90s mall culture, I grew up going to the mall was a big thing. You go to the mall, you go into the arcade, you'd hang out with your friends, you'd go to the food court, all that kind of stuff. Well, this movie is 100% 80s. It's filmed at like the mall in Sherman Oaks, California, where there's scenes from Commando filmed in there, Fast Times at Ridgemont High, like all that kind of stuff. Very frequently used mall that I've been to a few times because of that. And this is a group of friends that get stuck. Well, they don't get stuck. They decide they're going to hide out and party overnight in the mall. There is a new robot security system that goes crazy and starts to kill them, and they've got to survive this in a mall. So it doesn't get more 80s than that, especially like with the fear of the rising technology going haywire. We're, again, everything that's old is new again. We're right back to that with AI In here, they almost like a bunch of little Johnny number fives going around killing people. You got Barbara Crampton in here. Kelly Maroney is in here. So you have some 80s icon, like, horror icons there. And it's in a mall, man. It is 100% 80s vibe all the way through, right down to the waxed paper Coke and Pepsi cups that used to be everywhere. We'd get the little Gatorade waxed paper cups too. Chopping mall, 80s vibes all over the place. Well deserved as a place on this list, and it comes in at number 6. At number 5 on this list is one that has like an 80s like small town vibe, and again it has another actor that is 100% synonymous with 80s, so immediately that throws in more 80s vibes. Silver Bullet. Now, Silver Bullet may be my favorite werewolf movie of all time. You don't get more 80s than Corey Haim, who is handicapped in the movie, strolling around on his motorcycle / wheelchair type device. Absolutely crazy. In this small town. It captures 80s small town vibes, which is a little bit different than anything else we have on here. And the fact that you have Corey Haim in here, Gary Busey, another big 80s icon, the 80s like werewolf movies, Stephen King, like it's just filled with 80s, but from a little bit different perspective in that it's small town versus like city and chopping mall or They Live. This kind of captures more rural, like small suburbs, like distant suburb 80s vibes, which is something I'm very familiar with. I grew up like most of my life till I was about, let's say, I grew up going to my grandparents' farm, which is very, very rural. And even though it was only about an hour from Atlanta, man, you could get out real fast from the city. And then when I was about, when I was about 7, we moved to the south side of Atlanta, more very, very like almost inner city, but like just the outskirts suburbs. But I would spend my weeks there, and then I would go on the weekends if I wasn't playing football back to my great grandparents' farm, and the same thing over the summers I would spend there. So I had this very dual upbringing after a certain point, and so I get the vibes from both. This gives me the small town vibes that I grew up with a lot, where it was more rural. You walked to the video rental store when those became a thing. You would walk down to the little post office that was in a building smaller than most people's living rooms. That just had little P.O. boxes in there, and there was a mail lady in there, and you could pick up the mail for your great grandparents that didn't deliver right to their house. Like old school, man, train tracks, all that kind of stuff. This captures that side of the 80s vibes. Corey Haim helps add to that. So Silver Bullet cracks our top 5. Werewolf stuff in the movie is awesome too. Just love this movie. All right, at number 4 on our list is one that nobody can argue with either. I don't think. I am talking about Night of the Comet. Wow, the 80s. Catherine Mary Stewart, who I've said before, I had a little crush on her back in the day. You got Kelly Maroney in here again. This brings in another vibe of the 80s. How big the movie theaters were, right? How popular the movie theaters were. She's working at a movie theater when this starts. She's obsessed with beating the games in the arcade portion, like the little lobby of the movie theater, which they used to always have. So you get that 80s movie theater vibe now bringing into this. And then you're going to get the mall vibes in here later, because after the Comet goes over and she spends the night in the movie theater, her and her sister have to try to survive after this Comet goes over and turns all of the consumers into these zombie-like creatures. It's a very Night of the Living Dead-ish in a certain way. But then where do they go for a safe haven? And is the mall, which is just a very 80s thing. The hair in this movie screams 80s, just absolutely screams 80s. But the fact that you go from the movie theater to the mall for safety and protection, that's where a lot of the movie takes place, is just 80s fire. I mean, that's what it is, this movie. And this is a great 4K. Sneaky one that I watch around Christmas and New Year's too, because like it kind of takes place right around then. So Night of the Comet, all the 80s comes in at number 4 on our list. Now at number 3 on our list is one that's like a love letter to horror fans and a love letter to 80s horror and Hammer horror and all that stuff that came before. This captures all of that. It captures 80s horror vibes, 80s suburban vibes, 80s like TV, MTV culture vibe. All of it is found right here in Fright Night. There is no denying the 80s of this one. And like I said, this is like a love letter to horror fans, to Hammer horror, to old school horror, to 80s horror, to 80s suburban life as a teenage kid. This has it all. This has it all. And this is one of my favorite horror movies of all time. It's one of my favorite vampire movies of all time. As a matter of fact, it's number 2. And this movie just captures it to me. And the suburban angle of it is what kind of adds, because I'm familiar with that. Like I just said, I kind of had this dual upbringing. We moved a lot when I was younger. And like my home base was that farm, my great-grandparents' farm, where my grandmother also lived. So my grandmother, my great-grandparents, and my uncles and my aunt, my cousin, we were always there together. So I had that very rural base. And then we ended up moving around. So we were inner city and then suburbs again, and then the rural. So like I get it all. And that it captures that suburban style that quite honestly, I wish I could go back and give my kids that while I still have a little time, and move a little more rural / suburban rural, a little further away from the city, and give that small town vibe. This captures all of that in the 80s, and Fright Night, just a fun ass good movie. One of my favorites ever, regardless of genre, is Fright Night. All right, we have 2 left, and it's going to be one that, this one you're going to argue, some people might argue that's not really horror. It's horror. It's based on monsters. The soundtrack, the whole kids involved, this is 80s. This is 80s as a kid. 100%, it captures it all. Monster Squad. There's no way. The Rockin' Till You Drop. All of it just captures that time period of being a kid in the 80s when, like, you got together with your friends and you went on little ghost hunts and you spooked yourself out. Maybe like back in the day, we would go and explore like an abandoned barn or house, and then get into the woods and build a fort and tell ghost stories and like spook each other out and go on little ghost hunts and stuff like that. That's what this movie captures, that time period, except for they actually encounter real monsters, and it's the whole Universal monsters. You've got the Creature, you've got Dracula, of course, you've got Frankenstein, you've got the Wolfman, you've got the Mummy. So this Monster Squad really does meet up with them. But then the whole like 80s of it all, the small town is the same town used in for Hill Valley in Back to the Future, and you can see it. It's used in a lot of 80s movies. It's used in The Lost Boys as well. You have a lot there, and like the Burger King and sneaking and watching the drive-in movie. Man, it's all here. This movie just screams 80s. Maybe it's a little light on horror, but it is a horror movie in my opinion. I mean, it's horror based. It's based on monsters, Universal monsters. Absolute classic. 80s all the way. Right here is Monster Squad, rocking in at number 2 on our list. And finally, there is no question about this. This is like top 3 horror movie for me all time. My number 1 favorite vampire film. Nothing screams 80s more than The Lost Boys. Oh my gosh. From the music to the way they look to having Corey Haim, Corey Feldman, Kiefer Sutherland in here, the punk rock vampire look in this. Everything about this is 80s. It captures those summer 80s vibes when you're about to go back to school, getting out, exploring, doing things on your own, but still having to answer to your parents, and then, you know, getting caught up with the wrong crowd. Dude, this has it all. And then you have Corey Feldman and Corey Haim on top of it, and Kiefer Sutherland. And like I said, the whole punk rock vampires just screams 80s. The whole music scene that they're into, the riding, the motorcycles, like the dirt bikes and stuff. Y'all, all of that is 80s. The way they dress, all their hairdos, the earrings, the long earrings, all that's 80s. If you were there, nothing. A lot of people actually don't like this movie because they say it's too 80s. If you don't like this movie because you think it's too 80s, you're missing the whole idea of this movie. The idea of this movie is to capture the 80s, and it does it better than any other horror movie as far as I'm concerned. It is number 1 on our list. Corey and Corey, all 80s, all the time. You can't beat this one, in my opinion. I've got multiple copies of this one, and sleep all day, party all night. It's, you know, you must feed. You must feed on the 80s, and man, I love this movie. Screams the 80s. That is my list of the top 15 best horror movies that are the most 80s horror movies. So let me know what you think of the list. What should I put on here? There's another one that I don't have, so I didn't put it on here. Night of the Creeps, man, is very, very 80s. Very, very 80s. Hopefully we get a 4K of that soon. But let me know what you think about the list. Give me some that you would put on this list. Horror movies that just scream 80s to you. But they're also good enough to crack a list like this. So let me know what you think. What do you think of my list? What would you put on here? And I hope you enjoyed this. If you have, please like and subscribe. We do all kinds of stuff here. Lists, rankings, physical media news, 4K reviews, all from a fan and filmmaker's perspective. If that sounds like something that you're into, you can join the channel right here on YouTube or at my Patreon. You can find all that information below. And you can get your name and lights here, of course, behind the scenes looks at my filmmaking, special members videos, so much more, and everything goes back into the channel, and it really helps me out. Liking and subscribing, I'm telling you guys, the algorithm goes like this. It can be up 1 month and help you. It can kill you the next if your videos don't do well. And you know, we want to reach as many people and spread the pop culture word as possible. It is November when I'm filming this. I'm doing No Shave November, so I look a little different than usual, but it's fun and you know, raise some awareness there, and it's a little itchy. We'll see if I can make it. But until next time, be kind, rewind like always. This is Chase with AV Pop Culture, and I'll see you real soon. Bye-bye. I know.